There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breathes Books, here with a very special conversation for you. Two of my favorite writers, they both happen to be Irish writers, to talk about their most recent novels. Repeat guests on my channel, and holy smokes, they have both produced, in my humble opinion, their best work to date. First, we have Cauvery Madhavan, and please notice that I'm pronouncing her name correctly for the first time ever. I've been calling her Cauvery. Lots of other people have been calling her Cauvery, but I just learned I should be pronouncing it Cauvery Madhavan, and her latest novel, which came out in September, is The Inheritance. Rónán Hession had another novel out in May, his third, I believe, Ghost Mountain. And we are here to discuss both of them. Welcome, Cauvery and Rónán.
Hi, Sean.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having us again.
I'm really excited about this chat. I will say off the top, it's a bit of a gamble to invite even writers that I have read other books by them. It's a little bit of a gamble to prearrange a conversation like this, because what if I don't like the books? Or what if I like one better than the other? And this just turned out beautifully. Without a word of exaggeration, you have both outdone yourselves, and I just love these novels. So let's dive in. Cauvery, tell us the opening premise of The Inheritance.
Thanks for having me on, Sean. The Inheritance is about a young London Irish man of London Irish stock in 1986 who inherits a cottage in Ireland, very particularly in the west of Ireland, in West Cork. And he comes to Glengarriff in the Beara Peninsula at a time when most young men are actually leaving. It's a time of terrible depression and poverty and unemployment in Ireland. And it's what happens to him after he arrives. And I've tied his story with a historical thread from 400 years ago about the long march of O'Sullivan Bear. He was one of the last chieftains to hold out from against the English. So I've sort of woven the two stories together. Yeah, that's my book.
That's a great intro, and we're going to be talking about the setting in a little bit. Rónán, how about Ghost Mountain?
So Ghost Mountain is about a mountain that appears suddenly. It's not a ghost, for anyone who thinks that this is a pre-Halloween sort of show. It has two sunken hollows on the side of its slope, and then a third hollow just below, giving it sort of a ghost face expression. So this mountain appears suddenly, and there are a sort of loosely connected or disconnected group of characters who live in the vicinity, and each of their lives is some way affected beyond that initial appearance of the mountain. Not that it's necessarily the mountain causes it, but you see a community of characters whose lives are going to change. And really, the story of the novel takes that initial sort of premise, and we get to meet these characters and we see the interplay of their lives. And it's really looking at, I suppose, a couple of different things. One is the extent to which projection is important in people's lives. So we all carry around a version of ourselves that we project into the world. And the world kind of doesn't care. And that leaves us in a sort of in-between state where we don't get the validation we need. And that means when our lives change, we become really unsure of ourselves. And I think actually that's when people are at the most interesting. When I look back over my 3 books, I think that's what I'm most interested in, is people in transition. And then I think the other main aspect of the book is the presence of absence, the extent that our lives are shaped not just by cause and effect or what we're aware of, that actually it's much more shaped by sort of tectonic psychological and emotional movements. And one of the most powerful of those is the influence of absence in your life.
That last part of your description resonates in really interesting ways with Cauvery's novel. So we'll get into that. The setting of each novel is really important to the novel. And in fact, the setting is very much mountainous in both novels. So Cauvery, please tell us about the setting of The Inheritance. You've already mentioned it. Tell us about the mountain in your novel.
Yeah, John, the setting of the book in Glengarriff is very particular to the story that is set in the past. And the mountain, I was about 2.5 chapters into writing this book when I realized that I had set the story in the very cottage in which I was writing the story. You know, it's my own place, my own home. And I was researching it as I was writing. And I found out then, when I was about 2.5 chapters in, that the mountain ridge on which our cottage is set actually overlooked the two battlegrounds. So on the left of the house was where the English had camped, and in the valley on the right was where the Irish were hidden. So for me, not just the fact that my characters were set in it, but the fact that I was actually writing in a hut on a mountain ridge that overlooked that action 400 years ago was just mind-blowing. I just was so overcome with emotion when I realized that, the view that I was looking out on every day was the very same view that some Englishman or some Irishman must have looked on. And, on one side was the English camp, the other side were the Irish fugitives. So the location of the book in the story and the location of where I wrote it is very, very special.
You write about it in a very special way. It's so incredibly vivid. I felt like I was there, and it was so realistic. Everything I Googled was true, and so I could look at a picture of Garnish Island and the special tower there. I've forgotten the name of that tower, and all these things. That it was just gorgeously written and incredibly vivid. So when you say that the house you live in is a house in the book, so is that Marlowe's house?
Yes, Marlowe's house. Yeah. So I set the book in our own house just for convenience, because I knew the valley, and I just thought, sure, listen, I know the place. Why not write where I know? And only then to find out a little later on that it is actually the very, very crucial spot to the whole story, which just literally, I can't tell you, just fired me up so much. I went off into a completely different track then, in terms of my commitment to my characters in my book. Yeah.
Do you feed crow every morning?
I have this longing. I have such a longing to have a crow. I've thought about it a lot. And actually, the blind calf in the book was something that somebody had told me 20 years ago, that as a child, she had a blind calf. And I remember storing that away in my memory bank, thinking, I'll use that sometime. I will use that sometime.
And very memorable, and in fact, such a great way to show what one character calls Marlowe's. He's a bit soft in the head. He's he's a bit of a softie, and that his decision to take that blind calf or cow speaks volumes about him. Rónán, you take a very different approach to setting, which I think I would characterize as being your approach to setting in your other novels as well. So tell us about the setting of your novel. It's not set in a recognizable place, or at least I didn't think so.
No, it's not in a named place. The Ghost Mountain itself is kind of the focal point, both sort of psychologically and from a sort of geography of the book. But no, it's not set in a particular town, or it's not set in a particular place. Everyone has their own pet mountain, is kind of what I've discovered. When you talk to people about mountains, everyone has a mountain that comes to their mind. It's described in the book as limpet shaped and not very high, and bare and rounded like a knee. So we're not talking here about something that strikes awe, or something that has that sort of impressive silhouette on the sky. But nevertheless, that allows it in a way to kind of settle into the landscape, I think. Because obviously none of us have ever seen a mountain created. We have lots of explanations for how they arise, but they've never actually been witnessed. So I think it just sort of plays on that. And I've always liked the idea of the flexibility. I came across a phrase last night, which I haven't heard before, called lieu vague, the French phrase, which is used in the description of Waiting for Godot, which I watched last night. I've seen before, but I watched the film of it yesterday. And when I was reading about it afterwards, that it's in a lieu vague, the French, because it was originally written in French, obviously. So a vague place, somewhere that's familiar enough to be recognizable, but strange enough to be other. It's interesting. I remember when my previous novel, Panenka, came out, and it was during the pandemic. There was a brief break in the pandemic where they were allowed to have very limited book events. And I did an event down in Bantry that Cauvery came to.
Yeah.
And she kindly gave me a lift back to where I was staying in the landscape where her book is set. And she told me a little bit about what she was working on. And I think I must have mentioned something about Ghost Mountain. And the two of us were like, okay, we'll meet back here. We'll meet back here in 3 years with our books. You know, it's kind of that sort of thing. But it was very exciting. And I must say, when I did finally read Calvary's book, some of like even the cottages and the family dynamics, the atmospheres. I don't think I didn't necessarily recognize them as the same, but I sort of felt that there was a same spell at play to some extent in both books. And it's really, and when you hear Calvary saying that effectively the history kind of rose out of the landscape and took over her book, like I think that's really, it's really interesting how creativity works, you know, that it does seem like it's
Yeah.
visiting. And when something like that happens, you're like, okay, I'm no longer creating, I'm channeling, you know.
And just when you're talking about creativity, you know, that whole thing, the thread that runs through your book about creative rain, I found that it was almost like, are you writing about us as writers? Elaine is sitting at the rails, you know, displaying her paintings, and you know, she says, you say, as she sat on a stool and waited, she felt like she was being made to pull down her trousers and sit on the toilet in public. And I think, I mean, that line really resonated with me, because that's kind of more or less what we do as writers. You know, you write something and then you put it out there, and then you know you are basically sitting on a toilet with your trousers down in public and wondering how it's going to be received. And I just found that, you know, very interesting, that whole thing. And also there's a line that where you say, you know, the creative rain was beautiful, but it was easily overwhelmed by doubting sadness. And I just thought, oh, that's actually a writer's mind. You know, you've described a writer's mind.
Oh yeah, no, thanks very much for picking that out. Yeah, I think I wanted to write. I'm speaking a lot of French tonight, but another phrase I learned after the book was the phrase of artist manqué, which I think I learned from you, Sean, which is
Oh,
kind of,
yep. Yep.
and you used it in one of your videos. I suppose there's a lot of French people in Canada. You probably come across these phrases, but yeah,
Yeah, wannabe artist. Yeah.
yeah, an unfulfilled artist.
Unfulfilled. Yeah.
And Elaine does have pure inspiration, the creative range.
Mm.
She's access to that, which not every artist does. But nevertheless, the reality, the rawness and the vulnerability of it is difficult. And the creative range doesn't behave itself either. She also has the added complication that if you're a painter, you have to give your art away. A writer, thankfully, doesn't.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
We
that
yes,
still
doesn't
have our books.
yeah,
doesn't
exactly. Gosh,
she sells
that's
one
actually,
and it just
yeah,
feels like a phantom limb type of experience after she parts with it. Yeah.
yeah.
Before we move on from setting, Rónán, what's that hanging on your wall there? It looks very familiar to
Mm.
me.
Yeah, so the cover for Ghost Mountain is by a Cork artist called Tom Clement. So in other words, he's from the same county where Calvary's book is set. And I'm always very involved in the cover art for my books. My background's in music, and cover art is really important as music, as you
Mm.
know. So I had looked for a long time. It's very hard to get a very good mountain painting. And one of the reasons for that, and this is very central to the book actually, is that people tend to look at mountains as something intermediate. So, in other words, a mountain represents something else. It represents timelessness, it represents awesomeness, it represents something indefinably spiritual. But it's very hard to see a mountain for itself. So, a lot of paintings suffer from that because they try and play that side of the mountain.
Mm.
What I love about Tom Clements that the mountains are just the mountains are the mountains. And so when Ghost Mountain came out, because when my previous book came out, I bought a painting by the artist whose art features on the cover, Panenka. So I decided that I would save my pennies and buy a Tom Clement painting. So I got to go down to his studio. We met for lunch. We had a lovely chat about art and creativity. I love when you meet creative people. Actually, it's funny the first time I went to a writers' festival, which was Bantry actually, when Leonard and Hungry Paul came out. Like the first conversations, it's not like, what age are you? Do you have any brothers or sisters? You know, where is your house? It's like you meet someone the first time and you're straight away talking about deep stuff. It's brilliant. I love it.
Mm.
And we're talking with Tom, we had this great conversation about art, and we were like going, oh yeah, it's the same for writing. He's like, it's the same for painting. So it was a constant back and forth of shared experience. So yeah, so this is a Tom Clement painting, just to give you a full view of it. It's a sort of gentler palette, but it's got a lovely, it looks kind of muddy at the bottom. It's actually kind of a gold hue to it. And I look at it all the time. It's one thing about paintings, actually, I never realized until I sort of bought a couple of paintings. And I don't have anything expensive, just if there's any burglars watching, there's nothing very valuable in my house. But when you see paintings in galleries, there's so many of them and they're all great. And it's kind of overwhelming. It's a sensory overload to look at them. But actually, when they hang in your house, you kind of say, now I get it. You're supposed to look at it a couple of times a week, in no rush, and do that for years. And you have a relationship with it. Sometimes you come in and you look at it and it just gives you feedback, So you think, now I can kind of understand how paintings work. They're not just something pretty that you glance at and then you see 100 more examples and then you go home and think, I can't process any of that. It's something that you go back and forth with over time. So yeah, I really love looking at it.
It is a beautiful painting, really and truly.
I
Gorgeous.
love the cover of Covery's novel as well.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about this cover?
Well, Sean, that cover was designed by the book designer who did the Tainted as well. And his name is James Nunn. He read the book and designed the cover. It's a lino cut. And I just thought he captured it so beautifully, so beautifully. And I think when you finish the book, then you really appreciate the cover even more. For me, because I'm kind of, with a small publisher and only just making my way in the world. So, it's the sales teams that really determine whether they like the cover or not. So luckily for me, I liked the cover when I was first shown it. And, the sales team absolutely loved it. So it worked out really well.
Let's talk about your main characters to give viewers a more of a sense of what's going on in your book. Cauvery, tell us more about Marlowe.
Yeah, Marlowe. I actually kind of nearly was half in love with him myself when I
Me
finished the book.
too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of Marlowe's gentle nature, his love for animals, I think it was my son really who reminded me, of what it's like to be a young man who can also have a very soft side. My son, he's a vet. And believe me, Sean, animals literally melt in his hands. He has just such a way with them. And unconsciously, I think I kind of wrote that characteristic of my son into Marlowe. He is a little short-tempered, and yet he's not. He's a really relaxed, chilled out guy. I think a lot of his temper is to do with having found, first of all, he thought he had a kind of a sibling relationship. And, that's why he was always fighting with the sister. Then he finds out that the sister is the mother. And I'm not giving away the story because that's the very first line.
First line.
And, his irritation with her, his frustration that she wouldn't really reveal who the father or who his father is. And then, how he slowly... and this is unexpected for me. I didn't expect him. I expected him to be kind of constantly annoyed with her. But then, for some reason, he just, came to terms with it and became more understanding of his sister, because he meets a young woman who is in the exact same situation. I think perhaps that's, to see Kitty having suffered exactly what his sister had, perhaps that made him mellow a bit towards his mother, towards Mary.
His relationship with Mary is a big part of his character arc, his journey in the novel. And he finds out, we find out on the first line, and as soon after, like days, it seems like, after he finds out that the older sister he's been raised with is actually his mother, and that his ma'am is actually his grandmother, he gets into a little bit of an altercation at work and leaves London, and comes to this family cabin in his parents' hometown. What else? He's got an odd writing gig. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's the very tip of the Beara Peninsula is a little village called Alahis, and it has been for centuries a copper mining village, and a huge number of people during the famine migrated from Alahis to Butte in Montana, and they're called the Butte Irish. So I just wanted to bring that in for God knows what reason, and I just had him writing a column for the Montana Courier. It's a fictitious paper in Montana, writing about his life in West Cork. Because people do come in real life. People do come from Montana, from Butte, Montana, to visit. These are people whose ancestors would have left, hundreds of years ago. So
Kevin Barry's new novel, I think, is set in Butte,
I was
Montana. I
just
think.
looking
Yeah,
up the title of it to make that
yeah,
comment.
in the
Kevin
heart of
Barry's,
winter. Yeah.
yeah, it's
it's
actually
set
so
in Butte
freaky.
with Irish
Yeah,
characters. Yeah.
yeah. I just thought it was just so freaky that two people would be writing. Of course, I mean, his book is kind of, there's more of it. Mine is just a passing reference. Well, not quite a passing reference, but it is not a main character.
It's a weekly column, I believe, and that's not paying him well enough to make ends meet. So he picks up interesting jobs. We'll let the reader discover those that introduce him to lots of colorful characters in the community, including
Yeah.
one Kitty that becomes very important to him.
It's one thing I really love about Covery's, particularly The Inheritance, is I love that the financial realities are in the character. I love that in the book. When you and I, Sean, have talked about books before where somebody who works as a waiter suddenly books a 2-week holiday in the States and a flight at the last minute, and they just leave work and they have the money to do it. It's amazing. And I love that about that the actual, he needs to get work and the sort of realities of, I think that's handled really, I love how that's handled in the book. I think it's really,
Yeah,
that
thank you,
it's
Rónán.
a really important aspect of characters that I think often writers don't put into books, and I think it really makes them, believable, and makes them, actually makes you relate to them, I think.
Absolutely, and both novels explore, I think, poverty and wealth, class in
Mm-hmm,
interesting
mm-hmm.
ways. Now, actually, I better check with Rónán. Do you agree with me that Acho is the main character? I think it's a little bit debatable.
I would say that so Ghost Mountain is 3 books, so book 1, book 2, book 3 in this volume. The first book certainly, and into the second book, Acho is the main focus. Acho is a young man. He's described as a young soul, and his wife Ruth is an old soul, which is kind of most of our parents' generation would use that sort of terminology to refer to somebody who seems very settled in themselves as an old soul, someone who seems to always be at odds with the world as a young soul. So they're both against. Acho certainly is the driving force, and he's a young man. He kind of reminds me of I suppose, of 2 sons, and I pay attention to what young sons turn into, and there's a certain certainly on the internet as well. There's a lot of men who are kind of they look like adults, they walk like adults, they smell like adults, but they're not fully grown inside. They're not fully developed emotionally, and so their sense of self is very fragile. So they do one of kind of 2 things. One is either they adopt somebody to follow, and there's lots of people doing that, or they kind of keep to themselves and they hide the fact that they don't really know who they are. And it makes them very vulnerable because Ruth, his wife, is knows who she is. She's very settled in herself. She's very self-possessed. And that in itself, he's aware of the contrast between them. So that becomes, his dominant psychological state. He's kind of insecure and self-doubting, but not confident enough to assert that in anything other than sort of slight passive aggression and slight, self-pity. And I suppose what I look at through all the characters in the book is, I'm not necessarily getting into like reincarnation or that, but life reinvents itself all the time. The universe and the world is constantly reshaping itself. And some people can only make so much progress in a lifetime, and there's people like him, they are not going to, even when they have, and he has some incredible breakthroughs, but he's not developed enough to understand them. And so it actually becomes very difficult for him. But overall, over the 3 books, just to answer your question, is he the lead character? It starts out that way. I would say a character who comes later, a character called Ursula, that it ends up being her novel, I think.
I didn't think I was reading a comedy, not even at the beginning, but I found Acho's character and his kind of passive aggressive grouchiness and so many things. He gets himself into like little comic situations because he gets so frustrated and he doesn't really even know how to be grouchy effectively. that I don't remember smiling so much while reading a novel. I mean, they weren't laugh out loud moments because I knew that's not what I was reading, but I just got such a kick out of him, especially in book one. And it was just a joy to read about him and to, at various points identify with him.
My wife is married to somebody very like him, actually.
Oh, really? I'd like to meet that person.
Well, I actually have a line that I picked out because I just thought it was so funny. And this is it, this is Rónán describing Ocho. Seeing things through what was his way of making a liar of his rat's brain. Like,
oh.
I just thought that, that's actually just so funny that you would just say something through, just to kind of nearly spite yourself,
Benefit of the audience who haven't said that, he's there talking about he wants a ham sandwich, but he actually eats a peanut butter sandwich and he eats it to prove.
That's the perfect example.
I was talking to, I don't know if you know Sarah Gilmartin. I think you might have read one of her books, Sean. If you haven't, in terms of Irish writers, I think you'd really like her, and I think she'd be great to have on your show. But she was interviewing me. She's also a writer for the Irish Times. But she said the line she liked was, she said her husband said, "That's you." She said, there's a line where Ocho opens the fridge and he sees no food, only ingredients.
Yes.
That's me. That's completely me. I'm always, my wife walks in. I almost call my mother there. Walks in and I'm just staring at the fridge resentfully, and she'll say, "What's wrong?" And I'll go, "Oh, nothing. Just looking if there's anything."
You almost said your mother. I think that's what they call a Freudian slip.
Yeah. It's kind of worrying. Book 4.
Cauvery anticipated my very next question, which I wanted you to talk a little bit about Ocho's rat brain.
So basically at the start of the book, Ocho, he realizes he's got all this sort of stress and anxiety and uncertainty that he carries around in his stomach, and he makes reference to the fact that the stomach is described, or the gut is described as a second brain. I think it has 9 times the number of neurons as a rat's brain, and so he constantly talks about his rat's brain. So whenever he's talking about, and this is when I talked earlier about the underlay of our lives, that we, and it's something I think about a lot in novels. I think particularly in American fiction, it's gone down a sort of route of almost therapy speak, where everything's cause and effect. If I can get to the bottom of my childhood, I'll be able to move on with my life. If I can solve this grief, I can move on. So it's all cause, effect. When actually there's always like an undercurrent of craziness anyway. No matter where you get to in your life, there's always stuff you're carrying around. And I think with Ocho, he's kind of aware of this, but he doesn't have the sophistication or self-awareness to do much about it, other than live through it and slightly be a prisoner. So his rat brain represents that side of him, which is his impulses, his drives, that he doesn't really have a filter for, and that kind of run his life.
Yeah, and sad as it is that it does that, but the way he deals with it is so funny. And I think, Sean, you're absolutely right. There are some real laugh aloud, and I'm sure you never intended for us to laugh out aloud, but there are,
I do like that.
A few times.
And that kind of dark comic characterization really, for me, harkened back to Leonard and Hungry Paul. So yeah, really enjoyable. Grief, I would say, is a major, I don't know if theme is the right word, but certainly a part of both stories. Did you consciously decide to thread that into your story, or just talk about grief in your novels? Cauvery.
Yeah, I think for me, it was a not knowing that brought so much grief to Marlowe's life. And in the story that's set in the past, it's not even a grief. It's because the child in the past is not really grieving. We are grieving for him. He's just living his life. I wanted, well, not that I wanted, but I see now that, when you read the book, you are grieving for the child who was just living the life or the only life he knew. And it's interesting, Sean, that I never actually shed a tear or cried or anything when I was writing the book, but when I was doing the final edit, I was very tearful in some parts of the story in the past, I suddenly really felt for the child, and I think it resonated with what we're seeing happening in the world at the moment. With so many children dying, and so many children losing their parents, and it just kind of brought it all home. And I was very tearful when I was doing the final edit, just in that very last chapter. Yeah.
Yes, and there is also grief in the lives of other important characters. The closest neighbors to Marlowe are Mossy and Assumpta. And Mossy, it's not a spoiler, I think it happens in the early chapters,
Yeah.
Dies suddenly, and so Assumpta is left grief-stricken, and Marlowe gets very interested in a young woman in the town, Kitty, and she herself is still grieving the loss of her previous partner, her boyfriend.
Yeah. And I mean, there's anger, unfairness can make you grieve, because she has faced so much of unfairness, in her circumstances, that makes her grieve, and makes Marlowe grieve when he hears of it. So it's not just losing somebody that makes you grieve, but it's the way you're treated after that makes you doubly grieve, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely, and we're definitely going to get to talking about the stigma in both novels. Rónán, lots of grief in Ghost Mountain as well.
Yeah, it's funny actually, since I started writing, and particularly since I started reviewing and sort of reading books more analytically, I've noticed that actually grief is by far the number one subject matter of contemporary fiction, way more than love. I kind of feel my own experience of grief, I think I always come to, even when I wrote music, I was the same. I'd always sort of bring my own reality and say, does this match the way I'm seeing the depictions of this experience? And I kind of feel grief is often depicted as like somebody in a big warm coat looking in the middle distance, or a montage, or kind of grief music in the background, if you're watching a movie. But actually, one of the most frustrating things about grief for me is while you're grieving, you don't get a chance to press pause on the rest of life. So everything else goes on. There's a brief period of a couple of days during the funeral. In Ireland, funerals are held quite quickly. So a person dies on Monday, the funeral will be probably Wednesday, into the next day, and then you have a quiet house. So it's kind of that sense, and like the character Elaine, who carries grief from quite early in the book, which I won't give a spoiler, but it's a kind of grief where the people don't understand. And actually that can be the hardest grief, that kind of doesn't have the mark of legitimacy around it. And so you carry it, and it has nowhere to go. And it's funny, when you write a book, you don't necessarily know which bits of it are going to reach people. But there's a particular 2-page section about halfway through the book describing Ocho's experience with grief. And so many people have come up to me, and when I'm doing signing books or in Q&A, mentioning that section. And it really goes through the nuances that every grief is different to the person. Grief is not a uniform thing. Even for one person, you'll experience grief differently for every person in your life. And the way it affects you, there's also this character Ursula, when she's young, she kind of grieves for her parents, even though they're still alive. So these are all ways in which your brain, does things you don't want it to do. And to me, it's the confusion and the chaos, the spontaneity, the sort of unruliness of grief that I wanted to depict. So it's not something that you can pause the rest of the novel and say, okay, let's do a few things of grief here. The grief is going on at the same time as the craziness, and sometimes indistinguishable from it.
Sorry, Sean, could I just add here? Because I picked out another line from Ghost Mountain, and I just think it is literally the perfect description of grief. So this is it.
I'm gonna guess. See if I'm right. I'm gonna guess. Cauvery and I have been on the same page all throughout this chat. I think I know exactly what you're gonna read. Let's see if I'm right.
Okay. Ursula knew the word sorrow. It was worse than sad, because sorrow was being sad and not being able to do anything about it. And I just thought that was literally the perfect description. You can get over being sad, but you can never get over sorrow, because sorrow is something, whatever caused your sorrow, it cannot be fixed. And I think that's what Rónán was trying to say in that. I just thought it was such a beautiful line. really encapsulates
It
all
was.
the thing about grief.
Absolutely. It wasn't the line I had, but the line I thought that was in the section, Rónán, that you were saying you were getting a lot of feedback on was the image of a ladder cleaved in two,
Oh
being
yeah,
left with half a
yeah,
ladder. And I thought that
yeah,
was really
yeah.
struck by that.
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah. That's that 2-page section
yeah.
is the one that people bring to the table.
That was, I thought that's what I thought you were referring to. Yes.
I have to say, when I read that bit with the analogy with the ladder, I just thought, oh, that's what I'm going to be like if Prakash dies before me. That's my husband. Yeah, I just thought it was just so particularly spot on.
It's funny, these things. I think that section finishes by saying, all this was happening in Acho, but if you were to stop him in the street and ask him, he would not be talking to the part of Acho that knew about these things. And I feel that way myself.
Yeah.
It's in the book, but I can't say I've mastered any of that really.
I would say it's an important part of a lot of Irish literature, and certainly plays itself out in interesting ways in both of these novels. And that is the whole thing about sexual stigma, and even going to topics of paternity and morality. Riff on that for a few minutes.
Well, I mean, the whole issue around sexual morality was so clouded by, the double standards of the church and what the church was up, what so many members of the clergy were up to at that time. And the inhumanity of it. It's not just my book, Sean. It's like we've seen it in real life. Hundreds upon hundreds of children who was taken away from their mothers. And of course, it's not just the church. I mean, there was a whole swathe of society that knew what was happening, and everybody just kowtowed and kept the silence. And I mean, the unfathomable sorrow that has come out of that, generations upon generations. That's just unbelievable.
And it seems like there's at least two ways to deal with that in the characters' lives who are being shamed, who are being judged. Yeah. Mary, Marlowe's mother, I think it was probably her and her mother that decided to cover it up and keep it as hidden as possible. Whereas there's another character who I would say she has an outsized role in the novel, and that's Dolores.
Dolores,
who has a completely different attitude toward it.
Yeah, and I don't know where Dolores came out of, which part of my brain she came out of, but anyway, she made her appearance, and she's my favorite character in the book, Sean. I absolutely love her. She also is a survivor of an attempted abuse, and then all the abuse she got because she just tried to protect herself. Yes. It was unbelievable,
Yeah. And she had a defiant, very in-your-face defiance about it.
Yeah.
And lived a life that unlike any other woman in the community, as far as I understood it.
Yeah. And actually both her, both Dolores and Kitty were able to defy society only because they were only because they had homes. They were not homeless. I'd say if both of them had no homes, it would have been a completely different story.
This also plays out in really fascinating ways in Ghost Mountain, Rónán. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the sort of sexuality of the characters is quite important. One thing I wanted to do was to depict human nature as human, but also of nature. So my guide for both the treatment of death and sex in the novel is a program you probably haven't seen, but it's called Spring Watch. It's a BBC program, and they do seasonal programs, and it's about nature. And the thing about Spring Watch, it's on at tea time, family viewing, and they've no problem showing like a snake swallowing 3 birds' eggs and saying, look, we're going to have to show you this. This is what happens in nature. And likewise, if they show animals procreating, they don't put on that walk, 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 walk music or anything like that. Like, they don't try and sexy it up. So in literature, what I think it's important. A lot of the time when sex is shown in novels, it's the beginning of a relationship, and it's supposed to be erotic because it's part of the intimacy. I wanted to show we don't often see sex lives. So, the novel is set over a 25-year period. So, for example, Dominic and Elaine, if they had sex once a week, they'd have about sex 1,200 times. So sex is a very different place in your life when you have a long-term relationship. And actually, a lot of the depiction of sex in the book is not really sex. What's depicted is distance. So you often see this asymmetry where there's one person who's having sex and the other person who's slightly outside it. So it often appears at moments to sort of test in and show distance. So I play with that a little bit in terms of how I position it, how I express it. But I want to be clear that what I'm not interested in this novel, and actually I'm kind of not really that interested as a reader, is sexiness. You know, I'm not that's not something that, to me, that's like describing, chewing or something like that. You know what I mean? She pushed the food from her left cheek to her right cheek, squirted some saliva on it, washed it around on her molars. Like, that kind of stuff does nothing for me, I have to say.
I'm getting all hot and bothered, Rónán.
And I say that as a very sexy person, you know? So when I want to depict it in the book, I'm like, yeah, it's part of life and it's part of the characters. So I want to embed it in the characters, show them having a sex life beyond the sort of titillation of the initial sort of hotness getting together. And often it's where you have this asymmetry and there's either distance, sometimes connection, but often quite distance. And it's what I'm trying to do is make it fit with the rest of the novel, and that people kind of have secret selves, even when they're being their most honest. It's almost like you have the person you're being and then the person who's watching the person you're being. I have sort of read reviews, but they kind of misunderstand it altogether. But that always happens.
Well, I think I'm going to start using the euphemism, the term hee-haw from now on. I got something to think out of that term, hee-haw.
I did an event recently for Culture Night in the Department of the Arts. And I was doing a reading, and the head of the Ireland's Department of Arts came out afterwards and said, I really enjoyed the book, and my favourite chapter, I'd encourage everyone to go flip straight to the chapter called Hee-Haw.
I want to spring this famous quote on you. It's been attributed to the American writer John Gardner. It's also been attributed to Dostoevsky. It's quite possible that both of them came up with it independently. And this is it. This is the quote or the paraphrase. There are only two plots. I think that's a bit reductive, but let's just keep going with it. There are only two plots. A stranger rides into town, and a man, or let's say a person, and a person goes on a journey. And I thought of that as I was coming to the end of your novels and thinking about the stranger riding into town. I'd have to change the verb a bit, but I'm thinking in Rónán's novel, the mountain is the new character who comes into town, whereas it's Marlowe in Cauvery's novel. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I suppose, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. So many books and stories are centered around that theme. Change. Stranger riding to town is always about change.
And Marlowe coming into town, he does really have a strong effect on the community. And there was a great line about the community. Let me see if I can find it here. Kitty calls it the big jigsaw of Barra life.
Yeah.
And Marlowe has a real impact on it, and that's one of the delights of the novel. You show that big jigsaw so vividly, and I think Marlowe's arrival sets a lot of things in motion that wouldn't otherwise happen. Rónán, tear my analogy apart if you wish, but I'd like to hear your reaction.
So I think both of them are vague enough to apply to almost anything. But also so vague as to be kind of not really insightful. It might be my slightly, contrarian view, because I think there is a sort of sense that stories fit certain forms. But actually, I think in both, you could say that both those things arguably happen in the two novels we're discussing. But the heart, I wouldn't say they're the heart of the novels. And I wouldn't say that that's enough to help you decode them or understand them. And I think the more I'm at this and the more I read, and we've had this discussion before about reading outside of Western literature, you notice that what's uncovered in novels depends on where they're written to some extent, or which kind of cultural canon they come from. And certainly what appeals to me are novels that have a richness and a certain messiness and a certain multi-directionality to them. So in other words, they're going everywhere all at once, as opposed to the sort of Western thing, which is create a problem and then solve it, which I kind of think, the more I think about it, I think it has a whiff of economics about it, which is that a book has to be good value. It has to solve a problem. It has to, do something. It has to be worthwhile. And actually, I think that's kind of an economic mindset. That people say, well, what was the point of it? What did I get out of it? But actually, you don't really get into the really good stuff in your own brain and your own heart until you get to the space where you're actually no longer trying to achieve things. When you're actually, do you ever notice if you want to get to know somebody, right? You could do an awful lot of stuff. So you could go archery, you could do zip lining, you could go whitewater rafting, and at the end of the day, you probably don't know them that much. Like a lot of movies, like say Toy Story or Star Wars, people are just running away from explosions or they're running away from things the whole time, right? And they're on a journey of some sort. But actually, if you are in a hospital waiting room with somebody for 8 hours waiting for an appointment, you will get to know a lot about them. And some of what the power of novels, I think, and plotless novels, if you want to call them that, is in breaking you out of your expectation that you're going to get some value for money, and to some extent wasting your time, or to some extent shifting you out of your expectation that we have to be moving the plot forward here. We're not making any progress. We're not getting any closer to a destination. Because those are the destination novels. You get to the destination, you close them, and you're actually no further on. The ones I like to think about are the ones like, they say a good wine is one, you're gonna have the flavors in your palate for a long time after you swallow. I think that's a good sign of a novel. There's certain novels, and I've seen you discuss them, Sean. I've seen other people where you might have read the novel years ago, and you still remember what it felt like. You might not remember the names of the characters. You might not remember who exactly the murderer was, but you remember. Your body remembers it. And I think that's a sign that novels don't just work at the informational level. They're slightly reprogramming you. They're the novels sometimes you look at your shelf and you think, I don't really remember what happens in that book, but I remember what it feels like. So to some extent, the descriptions you give only count for novels. They might be fine for like cowboy novels, or they might be fine for a real exciting page turner. But for the novels that have always mattered to me, a stranger will come to town and then nothing would happen for the next 300 days, or next 300 pages. That would be my idea of a good time.
Great. Well,
but I think Rónán, we are both lucky that we are with independent publishers who are not looking for these value for money books.
Yeah,
that makes a huge difference, and I long live indies, because they are the ones that are taking the chances on books like the ones you've written, for example.
They also respect readers, I think, because they say, well,
yeah,
I bigger publishers can sometimes be, people will be put off by something in a book, the cover or a title, or we can't do that. They're real nervy about it.
Yeah,
we understand it, but the reader might not,
Yeah,
and as a reader, I wouldn't like a writer or a publisher talking down to me. So
absolutely.
I think independent publishers have a very simple sort of rule, I think, which is that if we think it's good, we think the reader will think it's good.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to ask each of you a specific question about something that I found absolutely fascinating in your novel. It's very specific. I'll start with Cauvery. In the historical section, there was a thing done with branches called plashing, and I'd never heard of it before, and it just captured my imagination. Tell us about plashing.
So plashing is actually the weaving of living branches, to form a barrier. So it was very commonly used to direct prey to maybe a trap. So it was a hunting technique, but then it was also used during times of conflict to lure your enemy into, thinking, oh, this is an easy way out, because especially if the conflict or the fight or the war was in a heavily wooded area, then instead of having to slash through the undergrowth, if you suddenly found yourself, everything parting for you in a very natural way, you just kind of be led down that path. And it was done so cleverly, and they needed nimble fingers, so they would always use children to do it, because you needed nimble fingers to be able to weave living branches, living trees, bushes into making like a kind of vaguely discernible path, but which was not too obvious either.
That's just so fascinating. And I'm going to sneak one more quick one in. One of the other things I loved from that section was the Irish, I don't know what the word is, fighters. They communicated, like one of them was coming back to camp, and the English were all around. So the signal that he sent to camp that he was coming or whatever was an out of season bird call.
But yeah, but that was something I
Oh,
made
I
up,
just
Sean.
love that so
Yeah.
much, because the English, it wouldn't mean anything to the English, right?
Yeah,
But they knew that, oh, we don't have that bird at this time of year, so
Yeah.
that's our guy. He's
Yeah,
coming back.
yeah.
Just fascinating. Rónán, the thing that similarly, it's not similar, but it similarly captured my imagination was the desire line. Tell us about the desire line.
Oh yeah, well, basically, this is true. Actually, things that
It
happen that
is, yeah. I'd
local
never heard of it.
authority, when they put in place a new park, and they construct a nice, neat diagonal path across it, and they pave it, and then they find that that's not the shortest route, and everyone who goes by cuts their own line. So you end up having the official path and then the real path that everyone uses because it's quicker. And that's called the desire line. So what local authorities around the world have learned to do is, when you have a new park, they don't put a path in, and then they let people walk the path they want, and then they pave that. I often think of that in my work. I'm a civil servant, so I've worked on, designing government policies for almost 30 years. And I often think of that, rather than try to regulate something and get everyone say, okay, everybody listen up, we've made a new rule, this is the new rule. You kind of just see what people do, and then you try and work with that, and that gives you your best chance, because there's a wisdom in that. There's a wisdom in desire lines. It's like when you listen to a crowd singing, it's never out of tune for some reason. Even though there's not, maybe hardly any of them have perfect pitch, but it evens out across the population. Everything evens out. So if you trust the population to solve it first, and then you kind of build on that. So that's a desire line.
Again, to stress, not in a similar way, but both of those, flashing and desire lines, I think there's some metaphorical things that you could, that I'm going to be thinking about from now on, but the fascinating aspects of both novels. My last question, I think, is both of these are screaming to be done on audio. Any plans in the works for an audiobook?
I'm sort of urging my publishers to consider it, Sean. It's quite expensive to do. Hopefully it will. Yeah, I would love for it to be.
Yeah, the conversation, the dialogue in the inheritance is just, it's one of the best parts. It's just so
I'd love for it to be a TV. I'd love for it to be a TV film. I really would.
Oh, brilliant. It's perfect for it. It's absolutely perfect for it.
Rónán, some of you, I know that Leonard and Paul came out as an audiobook. How about Ghost Mountain?
Panenka didn't, right? Because you were relying on, an audiobook, you're basically looking for a publishing deal all over again. You're basically looking for Audible to buy the rights. And if they don't, that's it. But the market's changed, and there's some new companies who still will get things on the same platform. So I must send you an email, Cauvery, about...
Yeah, thanks, Rónán. Yeah, thank you for that.
We're with a smaller company who are still very good, and they've done... And, the main thing is that it's still available through Audible, it's still available through all the different platforms. So yeah, it's being recorded at the moment. So we have to audition a couple of... Because one of the things about Ghost Mountain is that when I was writing it, when I was doing my day job during the pandemic, I had no printer because I'm not in the office. So reading on screen, my eyes got tired. So I used the read aloud function on Microsoft Word. And then I changed computer. I'm now on an Apple computer, which I've never used before until I got this. And there's a different selection of voices, and I end up using this voice of this character, Junior. And I think we talked about that before, maybe. So Junior is this like nasal American voice, kind of goes, Rónán is talking to Sean. John is talking to Cauvery. She used to be called Cauvery. Whatever. So I kind of wrote for the rhythm of Junior. So when it comes to the audiobook, then, in terms of, and in fairness to company, they were like, tell us some voices you like. And it was kind of hard because a lot of people who do audiobooks are actors. So they kind of find it hard to do the dry delivery. They find it hard to say, Sean, was into very Cauvery. We used to call her Cauvery. But of course, they can't help doing the acting stuff. And actually, actors are not necessarily the best people to read because acting and reading are different. I often find writers read their work better than I hear on the audiobook. But anyway, I know you're a big audiobook nut, Sean, and you like to read with the audiobook, so you know more about it than I would. But anyway, they asked me for voices, and the voice I really wanted actually was John Mitchison. I don't know if you know John Mitchison. There's a podcast backlisted.
Yes, yes,
John
yes.
is one of the. John has this beautiful, rich voice, and I've been on Zoom events where John has read, and I was like, keep reading, keep reading. His voice is
Absolutely.
deep richness, So we got an actor who has a lovely, rich tone, his Scottish accent, and it gives a really lovely tone. And he did like a sample of like 20 pages, and I listened back to him. And I was like, we have our guy, So it's sounded really nice. I think newer companies are coming along. What I'm saying is that for small publishers, it's actually hard to get audiobooks done, but there are some other options coming on that weren't there even a year ago. So hopefully that'll make it easier. And I'd love to hear your beautiful words read in audio, Cauvery. I think it would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Rónán.
Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. Two really incredible novels. Thank you so much, Cauvery and Rónán.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks,
It's always a
Sean.
pleasure to talk to you.
Wonderful
And
to be
thanks
back.
for all your book enthusiasm, which is a regular part of my Friday coffee break.
Thanks so much.